Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Clovis, and today I'm speaking with Agustina Paglayan, author of Raised to Obey, The Rise and Spread of Mass Education. Agustina, welcome to the New Books Network.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Well, thanks for being sorry. So I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
Sure. I'm a professor of political science and public policy at the University of California, San Diego. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, and my work focuses on how politics shapes education systems, how education shapes politics. And so I've written a lot and published a lot on this topic. And the book we're going to talk about today builds on award-winning research that I've done on these topics.
That background sounds like one that's focused very much on contemporary policy. What led you to write a book about the history of mass education in the Western world?
Absolutely. It is a book that, despite being about the history of education, is driven by concerns about contemporary education systems. Before I became an academic, I worked for many years in Washington, D.C. at the World Bank, and then I also worked at Stanford University's Center for Education Policy Analysis. And so both from the perspective at the World Bank on education systems in developing countries and the subsequent experience I had looking at education systems in the United States, what struck me was that a lot of emphasis was being placed in understanding what works to promote education improvement and promote student learning, and not as much emphasis was being placed on understanding why governments don't adopt the types of education policies that we know promote student learning. And so that was the goal that was behind the motivation for writing this book, was to try to understand why governments around the world are failing to adopt policies that promote student learning, and why, as a result of that failure to adopt such policies, we have such deficit in students' skills around math, literacy, and so on. And so the book ended up being a book about the history of education systems, because in order to answer this question about why governments are failing to do better by children, I did have to go back in time to find an explanation. But the roots and the goal were about understanding current education systems' failure to deliver on their promise to promote living standards and ensure that all kids have the skills needed to thrive.
Given your approach, which is multinational, I was thinking that this would be something where you'd be talking about different motivations. And yet, as you explained at the start of your book, you find a commonality of an approach that in terms of the emergence of mass education or mass public education in the 19th century, and you find a common motivation. I was wondering if you could explain what that motivation was and how it is that we see it in a variety of different political systems, in a variety of different locations over a rather large period of time.
Yes, and let me start first with the common motivation. And that common motivation was to use education as a tool for social control. So the underlying motivation behind the creation of public school systems was not about leveling the playing field, promoting social mobility, providing skills for industrialization. It wasn't driven by democratic ideals. All of these things that we might tend to think today were the reasons behind the creation of broadly accessible primary education. That was actually not what drove the creation and expansion of these systems. What governments were after was a tool, in this case schools, that would enable them to mold the moral character and the political values of individuals in order to ensure that these individuals would accept the status quo, or would respect the state's authority, and would follow the law. And so the goal was about creating law-abiding citizens who would respect the state's authority. And what is striking to me, what was striking in the course of doing the research for this book, was precisely what you noted, that this goal was pervasive. It was there from the get-go in absolutist Prussia, which was the country that pioneered the idea of using mass primary education as a social control school, so as a social control tool, but it was also present in democratic countries like the United States during the early republic. And fast forward to the 21st century, and we can come back to that, but it continues to be pervasive even to this day, that the primary goal of primary education should be to create future citizens who are going to respect existing institutions and work within the current institutional framework.
You make it a point in the book of using the word indoctrination, and it is one that can be triggering for some people today. And yet, as you explained, it's a word that's fitting in its traditional definition, and some of the substitute words that are used to describe this process even today are very much in keeping with that notion of mass education established as a form of indoctrination.
Exactly. So today, for example, in the United States, the term indoctrination is often thought of as, that's what communists do, that's what fascists do, this is not what we do. What we do is socialization through schooling. But back in the day, in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, education reformers had no issue whatsoever using the term indoctrination to refer to what schools were doing and were supposed to do. It was really only during World War I, with all of the antagonism between the US and Germany, that then people started thinking, oh, what we don't do is not what Germany does. They do indoctrination, we do socialization. But if you take away sort of this semantics and you look at the definition of the word indoctrination in the dictionary, it defines indoctrination as the process of teaching someone to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And therefore, indoctrination is not defined by what is the content that you're teaching. You can teach someone to accept uncritically the idea that democracy is the best political system in the world, and you can teach someone to accept uncritically the notion that communism is best. And if you're teaching it through a process that does not encourage critical thinking and instead seeks to instill these ideas in an unquestioned way, then that either of those messages constitutes indoctrination according to the dictionary and the common use of the word.
Now, this is something that you support with both a lot of data analysis and also by delving into the contemporary educational theories about how to teach students, what was the goals of mass education. I was wondering if you could delve a bit further into what some of those contemporary theories were and how those ideas and concepts were reflected in the designs of public education systems by states in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yes, and so the period of foundation of Western public primary education systems begins in the late 18th century with Prussia, and then primarily in the rest of Western countries throughout the 19th century. Now, at that time, in the 18th century, the kinds of ideas that were in vogue were the Enlightenment ideas. And these were ideas that today, when we tend to think of the Enlightenment, we tend to think of philosophers and intellectuals who advocated for individual autonomy and the importance of reason in making decisions. But when you actually read what Enlightenment philosophers said, specifically with respect to the education of the masses, their focus was on the importance of a state-regulated education system for teaching obedience to children. So, for example, Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan spends a great deal of time or pages to explaining how in order for the sovereign to have legitimacy, children need to be taught to accept authority and to obey the sovereign. Likewise, fast forward many decades to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who many people today would consider a liberal political philosopher. Yet when you read what Rousseau wrote with respect to the education of children, he argued, for example, that in the same way that there are laws for adults, there should be laws for children. And those laws for children should emphasize the importance of obedience. And the state Rousseau argued, is the one that has the most to gain from teaching obedience to children, and therefore the state should become involved in educating children for obedience. So this is just a set of the ideas that circulated around the time that then became extremely influential in shaping what political rulers in the 18th and 19th century believed about education. Essentially, the ideas that they had access to about mass education were not the ideas that we have today about mass education should promote individual autonomy, mass education should promote social mobility. That was not within the scope of things that they considered, because when people talked about mass education, back then they thought of something completely different that was focused on instilling obedience, discipline, and so on and so forth.
So we're talking about this in terms of a goal of the system and an intention. How was this reflected in the various reforms that were applied over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries? Was it just in terms of pedagogy? Was it just in terms of applying theory? Or do we see it in aspects of, say, teacher training or other parts of the process of preparing and developing educational systems?
One of the things that I show in the book is that this goal of inculcating a specific set of moral values, supported obedience and respect for authority, this was embedded throughout the entire character of education systems when these systems emerged. So definitely within the curriculum, there was a strong emphasis on moral education, which wasn't just a standalone subject. There, throughout, for instance, when kids learned how to read and write, they used texts that emphasized moral messages as well. But even beyond the curriculum, there were, for example, as you were mentioning, in teacher training and recruitment, one of the key things that prospective or aspiring teachers had to demonstrate in order to get a teaching certification was that they had the right moral character, that they were going to be good moral examples of the kinds of values that the state wanted children to learn if they were to get the opportunity to be a teacher inside the classroom. Likewise, the training of teachers was done typically in normal schools, who many times operated as boarding schools. The goal of having teachers immersed for 3, 4, 2 years, depending on the country, in these normal schools was precisely to mold the moral character of future teachers. And so normal schools were guided by very strict codes of conduct that sought to instill in teachers the importance of silence, the importance of discipline, again, so that they would internalize the same values that the state then wanted children to internalize. And then two other really important parts of the design of education systems that further contributed to the goal of promoting the moral character of children in the way the state wanted to shape that. One was the introduction of a centralized school inspection system that enabled the state to ensure that the curriculum that the state was sanctioning was indeed being taught by teachers inside the classroom, and that schools and teachers were respecting the state's education agenda and implementing it adequately. And so these inspectors would be deployed and then would check and monitor and write reports back to the central government saying, okay, this school is doing well, this one isn't. And then the other key mechanism for advancing the state's moral education agenda was this creation of compulsory schooling laws, because the state had the perception that parents were not going to be willing to send their children to schools that were not particularly designed to promote social mobility, skills, and so on. And the concern that the state had was, how do we actually ensure that children attend these schools, given that the state has something to gain from that and parents probably don't want to send their children to school? And so what they did was they passed compulsory schooling laws to force parents to send children to school. And alongside those compulsory schooling laws, they also had a number of provisions with penalties for parents who would refuse to send their children to school. It could be a fine, it could be in some extreme cases, removing the child from their home and placing them under the care of the state, or forcing the parents to do work in a forced labor type of setup, and so on. But basically, curriculum, teacher training, teacher recruitment and certification, school inspection, and compulsory schooling were all of the various ways in which the state advanced its indoctrination and moral education agenda.
Now, the bulk of your book is focused upon describing the historical evolution of this, but it's a book that you make clear in it is designed to inform the modern day debate about education. What do the origins of education that you discuss in the book, what sort of insights or lessons do they offer for our debate about education today, especially in modern democracies?
So before we get to the modern democracies, I just want to think of education systems worldwide, around the world, the fact that they are failing oftentimes to level the playing field, failing to equip children with basic literacy and numeracy skills. And one of the things that the book reveals is that this is true by design. It's not that education policymakers, for instance, don't know what are the right policies to promote learning. It's rather they don't have the willingness to promote learning because they are concerned that if they were to do that, that could potentially create a more subversive population. And so the primary goal of primary education in many countries continues to be to advance a social control, or in current language, socialization goals, and create good citizens as defined by the state. Now, the other set of countries that we also have are countries where maybe politicians and policymakers would want to promote skills and social mobility through education systems. But the trouble they face, the major challenge, is that the education systems they've inherited were not set up to accomplish that. And so we have schools where, for example, the classrooms where I teach and my colleagues and many teachers teach, they are not set up to promote critical thinking. They are set up in a way where the teacher stands in front to make sure that kids sort of accept the teacher as an authority, and the kids are sitting in rows facing the teacher. So the very architecture of classrooms is designed to highlight the authority of the children as opposed to placing children at the center of the learning process. Likewise, there's pervasive emphasis on rote learning and memorization. Again, not an emphasis on critical thinking, which was what you would expect to see in current times, and particularly for democracies, right? Back to then the specificity of this in democracies. What you really need for democracy to thrive is not an emphasis on instilling a specific set of beliefs, but an emphasis on promoting every future citizen's capacity for critical thinking, for making up their own mind about things and having the capacity to reason, to challenge existing assumptions behind an argument, to assess evidence on their own, to make conclusions about the validity of someone else's or their own argument. And so schools aren't prepared to do that because the way in which we've set up schools is not designed to accomplish that. And teachers are not trained to do that either, even if they think that that's important. Many of the ways in which education systems are functioning today have not really changed radically compared to what they looked like in the 19th century.
To what degree do you think this can be changed given what we know? Because there's a certain amount of inertia in the existing system. Do you find that there are still people who advocate for this traditional model of education, even if they're not aware of it? And how does the awareness of this inform the debate in ways that promotes the change that you're implying is necessary versus, say, this argument that perhaps there is still a place for this form of education?
Can you repeat the second question?
Well, I was thinking about how in your book you talk about how, for example, how foreign aid, which oftentimes goes towards supporting these existing systems, can be very damaging when it's applied to educational systems in, say, post-conflict settings. So I'm wondering to what degree we can actually, to what degree there is, people who are going to advocate for maintaining the traditional system versus and adopting some of the the newer ideas behind education in terms of its goals, as opposed to keeping with what we currently have.
Absolutely. There's a lot of advocating for keeping things essentially the way they are, but improving marginally. So the primary goal, if you look around the world, is let's keep the structure of schools the way they are, the setup the way they are, but let's try to make teachers more effective teaching skills. And that's a pervasive approach, right? No one is discussing at a large scale system wide, let's adopt John Dewey's approach to education, or let's adopt a much more liberal or progressive approach to education where the child has a say over what the curriculum looks like, what assessment looks like, and so on and so forth, right? So that would be considered sort of a very radical approach to education. I think the only reason it's considered radical is because we're comparing it to what's been inherited, but there's no reason to think that what's been inherited should be the current norm, given that the systems that we have that were inherited a completely different time. But you are absolutely right that there are also cases where people are pushing for the current norm of schools being designed the way they are, with unawareness that that's what they're doing. And I think the foreign policy points that you raise and that I raise in the book is particularly important. So one of the things we haven't talked about that is a really important argument in the book, and I provide a lot of evidence on it, is that historically and from the 19th to the 21st century, efforts to indoctrinate through education have become particularly pervasive after episodes of mass contestation of the status quo and episodes of civil war, episodes of insurrections, rebellions, mass protests, and so on. These are the episodes when governments become especially anxious about the moral character of the population and then turn to education to try to teach people that the status quo is actually okay. And so the danger with foreign aid in post-conflict settings is that it can and often has inadvertently fueled and funded indoctrination efforts, because by targeting foreign aid to post-conflict settings, again, these are precisely the settings where the book shows we are more likely to see indoctrination efforts by governments, and foreign aid agencies don't typically monitor the details of how these funds are being used, and so inadvertently they often end up fueling and funding these indoctrination efforts. This happened in Rwanda after the 1990s. It happened in Peru in the 21st century after the conflict with Shining Path, which is one of the cases that I talk about in great depth in the book, and other cases as well, Indonesia in the 1970s. These are all cases where governments made major education reforms to expand education and to shape the particular way in which people understood history so as to accept the status quo and the incumbent government. And these were all cases that were also heavily funded by international organizations, including the World Bank and others.
We appreciate the time you've taken to speak with us. But before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now?
Yes. So one of the key things that I'm focusing on right now is making sure that the book reaches a wide audience, because I didn't just write this for academics. This is a book for people who care about threats to democracy, for people who care about the failure of schools to level the playing field, for people who care about foreign aid, for people who care about all of the anti-CRT and curriculum and culture wars we've had in the US over the last several years. And so that's kind of one of the key things that I'm currently focused on. And then the other thing is advancing a future agenda that stems from this book, research agenda, which is to understand under what conditions are politicians actually willing to adopt policies that promote learning, that level the playing field, and so on. So when do politicians who are not necessarily concerned about what's best for children, who are concerned about their political career, but under what conditions do they become interested in adopting policies that are good for children, that do promote autonomy, that do promote critical thinking. So that's my next book, if you want.
Well, it sounds like a fantastic continuation of what you're doing with the book. I wish you the best of luck with it.
Thank you, Mark.
Agustina, thank you very much for the time you've taken to speak with us. I hope you have a wonderful day.
You too.